Today, I'm releasing our Charge Safe, Ride Safe action plan to help New Yorkers use e-bikes and scooters safely.
Well, they finally did it. It was just 4 months ago that City Council introduced these bills to try to combat the concerns they have over battery safety in New York City. From my side, I think that they're pretty smart bills. I mean, it's often difficult for these kind of unprecedented things of like, how do you legislate around them? I feel like this direction makes sense to make sure that all the batteries are tested. I mean, it's certainly something I've been focused on personally through my shops. A while ago, I came to the realization that most e-bike batteries in the market are not tested. That kind of surprised me and certainly concerned me, especially considering most people are keeping these things in their homes. So I made the decision that we're only going to sell products that are certified by a third party. Unfortunately, the rest of the industry doesn't feel the same, that they want to do this thing voluntarily, so government's stepping in. And from my side, I think that this is the first of many. In this video, I'm just going to cover a little bit about what's going on, what the new legislation is, what it means, and how this overall impacts the landscape of e-bikes in the US, because I do think that this change is likely going to set a chain of events to follow from here. So there's a lot of different bills that were signed into law yesterday, but I wanted to focus primarily on the ones that are most pertinent. I think that are going to have the biggest impact on the industry specifically. The first of which is requiring e-bikes and batteries and scooters to be certified to an independent testing standard. So this historically has not been required in the US. To be legally sold, rented, or leased in New York City, an e-bike will need to be certified to UL 2849, a standard that covers the full e-bike electrical system, including the battery, the charger, and the motor. Otherwise, a powered mobility device will need to meet UL 2272, and all lithium batteries sold separately were required to meet UL 2271. A lot of people ask is like, well, are these the only standards? The FDNY has said that they'll consider other standards, but at the moment they don't really recognize others. And what other standards do exist? I mean, one of them is EN 15194, which is what Europe uses. And I've been looking into that and saying like, well, maybe if other brands, they are certified to this European standard, they would accept this here. And I'm not so sure that they will. For one, that standard also includes requirements for the e-bike to meet European e-bike speed standards, motor power standards, many of which are not consistent with what happens here. But the other thing that's kind of more concerning in relation to that standard is adherence to that standard is not as consistent as it might be with other standards. There was a study done several years ago and they found that 80% of products are not in compliance. So they might say that they're in compliance, but they're actually not. So it sounds like there's not actually like a strong enforcement there. Whereas UL, it's a little bit different and they actually have a serious arm to their organization that actually enforces this thing against counterfeiting. Because I'm sure some will say like, oh, well, I'm just going to put a UL label on my thing. It's not that simple. There's a lot of powers that are actually given to the UL organization because it's kind of an extension of some government regulation. I've spoken on other videos kind of what UL means, so I won't go too deep into it here, but basically it's underwriter laboratories. They were started in the early 1900s, and they basically were started because people started putting electrical lighting in their houses, and they were having fires, not too different than what we're experiencing now with lithium batteries. They created a laboratory to test products to know that they're safe, and provided they were able to say that they were safe, the insurance companies were comfortable insuring the building. This is another big concern that's coming up a lot. There's a lot of buildings that are saying, no, you can't have e-bikes or e-scooters in our building. That's a big challenge. I mean, this is a great opportunity, a great mobility solution for so many people, but if you can't keep it inside your home, that really limits the possibilities of how you can use it, especially if we don't have too much secure bike parking and different things like that. There's actually some other discussion. It's called Charge Safe, Ride Safe plan. They plan to implement a lot of different things, including outdoor micromobility storage, charging solutions, especially at New York City public housing. This legislation was introduced March 20th, 2023. This video is going to come out a little bit later this week, but law will actually come into effect fully in 180 days. So companies have about 6 months to get in compliance. There's a lot of companies that are going to be pretty significantly impacted by this. How quickly can they comply? What UL says is that generally speaking, somebody can comply within 4 to 8 weeks if they're already technically in compliance, but they're actually just trying to get a stamp. The thing is that most companies are likely not actually in compliance, not actually remotely close. That likely will create a big challenge for them to get to that point. I suspect that many of them probably will just cease selling in New York. Some might choose to sell online into New York, or even operating just outside of New York City specifically, and technically operate in this gray area, because that's another thing that's not really so defined. That seems to be something that's underway to be addressed as well. In addition to this legislation, there was separate legislation introduced on the federal level from Congress members from New York, requesting that the CPSC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, who's responsible to manage consumer products, which are electric bikes, electric scooters. So what they're requesting is CPSC makes a requirement on the federal level for UL to be required. There's a precedent set because this did happen with hoverboards historically, and that happened pretty quickly. There's a good chance that it will happen here as well. It's kind of an interesting thing because New York City was one of the last places to actually act on, some of the e-bike legislation and actually introduce legalization of e-bikes, but they seem to be the first to act on a lot of these safety concerns. And I think that they're actually going to lead the country in this regard. One, I do think that there's a good chance that this national legislation will pass. Two, we're already starting to see certain things happen on a national level. So just today, a day after this legislation was passed in New York City, the federal government reintroduced e-bike rebate. And they're saying in the rebate that the batteries need to be certified as well. The other thing is there's likely insurance companies are going to make the same sort of requirements. So point being is having a certified battery is probably a good move if you want to really future-proof yourself. And if you're a company that's introducing yourself into this market, it's a good thing to be thinking about. The challenge is for a lot of the companies that are already in this market. If you look at the market overall, kind of back of the napkin math, you could probably say that, 80% of the e-bikes on the market at least are not certified to UL. So what happens there? Specialized is one brand, and they actually have like a flagship e-bike shop in New York City. I don't know what they're going to do. Rad Power is another brand. They have a flagship shop here. I was actually just reading on Reddit. Somebody had reached out to them and say like, well, what are you going to do? And they said, well, we're certified to EN 15194. I don't know that that's really the same. I mean, it could be possible. Aside from Rad Power, there's so many other brands, and there's many brands that probably most people don't even know about. The point being is, in the mainstream e-bike market, the likes of Shimano and this and that don't have this UL certification. I'm sure they're working on it. When you hear the CPSC it's saying like, we urge you to get in compliance with this, it's a good sign that you might want to do something here. But I should talk about like, what does compliance actually mean? What are these standards? It's kind of broken down into two separate categories. There's what's called functional safety, which is primarily on the software side of things. The other side, which is just the physical limitations of the product. The functional safety thing is kind of interesting. The idea is that there's actually functions built into the battery management system that ensure that if something goes wrong, the battery shuts down, that it prevents it from causing further harm. The other side of it is the hardware side, addressing things like common scenarios that might exist: dropping the battery, operating extreme heat, water, having in the rain, submerging it, different things like that. What's going to happen? What I found to be really interesting is this concept of functional safety, and it's something that actually impacts like most products that we interact with on our daily lives. The interesting thing is that many products don't have this basic functional safety. There is also some level of like self-certification, because the reality is UL is not going to go through all of your source code, but they might do some sort of an audit. They're just looking to say that you do have safety standards in place. You're building your software in such a way that it has standards and safe measures in place. For the most part, I think most consumers likely have the expectation that products are safe, that there's someone kind of protecting them, or there's some sort of brand protecting them. And I guess that's the other challenge as we're operating more in this like global economy and can get products from all over the world. You have companies like Alibaba that you can buy a company direct from a manufacturer in China. What many might not know is that we have this issue in New York City that, say, last year there was about 200 fires. You know that in a 5-year period, there was 10,000 fires in China? That's from 2013 to 2018. Granted, there's a lot more people and there's a lot more e-bikes, but that's a lot. These products, meaning the same standards, built for that market, are coming to the US. Naturally, yeah, it needs to be addressed on the federal level. I don't want to get too much into that. I don't want to get too much into the politics of things, but some will say, well, why does it not happen so much in Europe? One, there are more products available in Europe that are made in Europe. They also have this anti-dumping rule in place. So there's additional tariffs put on top of products that are being imported from China. There's also a rule that comes into play when it comes to customs called the I gotta try to pronounce this. I'm not so great at doing this, but the de minimis rule. I should probably listen to somebody else say it, but you get the idea. Basically, what it's saying is that like if something's very low value, then you don't really need to like do anything special with it. In Europe, I think that rule is 150 euros. In the US, it's $800. Products can be imported through customs and that sort of thing with very little oversight, provided they're under $800 in value. If you look at some of the really cheap e-bikes out there on the market, many of them might fit within this category of being under $800. That's another thing that's kind of weird, and we're not really sure how it's going to get addressed. But it's also the way that they operate. They seem to operate a little bit more preemptively, where in the US we generally operate more reactionary to hazards. So the assumption is that everything's safe until it's not safe, everything's legal until it's not illegal, where in Europe it's kind of more like, well, let's figure out what the law should be and like let's build upon that. I know different people have different opinions on what approach is better. What do you think? I'd be interested to know. But the reality is, like, I don't want to be involved in this stuff. I don't want to be advocating for safety standards. I want to focus on like selling good products, giving a good experience to our customers. But I feel that I have this like personal responsibility, having this knowledge, having this experience, that I need to talk about these things. If you wanted to read the standards, I'll put a link down below. You can see things like who's involved in creating the standard. You'll find that actually many people throughout the industry were involved in this. It wasn't created in a bubble. It's not some government conspiracy to try to control people. Specifically and related to the certified, people will say, well, it's going to make everything super expensive. The chief of FDNY said that it should only add like 10 cents per battery, but I think that that's actually like if you're already in compliance, it shouldn't make much of a difference. But of course, if you're a factory and you're not meeting any of these sort of standards, it can be very difficult to get in compliance. That likely will cost a significant amount of money. If you're a company that's working with the factory that's not in compliance and you have to change factories or something like that, or change form factor, or change connectors, it will be either very difficult or nearly impossible to sustain that sort of thing, at least in this market with this requirement. But can you make an inexpensive product with UL? Yes, I feel very confident that you can. For example, there's one company, it's called Velotrick, $1,300 for their e-bike. I've actually been thinking about creating some sort of repository of these different e-bikes that meet standards that might be less expensive than, say, like a Bosch powered e-bike, which I think they really kind of help push the standard in a lot of ways. They've been one of the first ones to adopt it voluntarily. Their products are more expensive. I mean, they start generally around $2,500. In our shop, we specifically just sell Bosch powered bikes, but what I was thinking is that we could create something and that could help like fund it, if you will, is we could have like affiliate links. So I've actually been signing up for like affiliate programs for different things. So we'll put links below. Feel like a real YouTuber now, like recommending products with affiliate links. But I'm not sure if we're so ready to offer these other products in our shop just yet. Another company is called Aventon. They are also widely available in many bike shops throughout the US and relatively large company, but I really respect the fact that they are in compliance with UL. The other bigger company outside of Bosch is Panasonic, but they actually don't have too many products in the US specifically. The other things that are happening is they're going to restrict the assembly and reconditioning of lithium-ion batteries, so you can't fix or repair batteries. Really, once a battery is certified, you can't like repair it and recertify it, not in any sort of easy way. And there doesn't seem to be any sort of facilities set up to do that. But I also wonder if it makes more sense just to strip it down to its kind of bare materials and then rebuild it from there. It does seem like that sort of strategy is more the play that's happening in the industry. There's a program called Call to Recycle. To my understanding, they can recycle about 90% of the batteries batteries resources, and they can be reused and reintroduced into the supply chain. A lot of people who are into the DIY space and this and that, like, I get it. I respect what you're doing, but at the same time, we got to think like bigger than what we're doing for fun here. If we want this to be like a real mobility solution, it needs to be treated that way. It needs to be serious, it needs to be safe, and it needs to be applicable and accessible to all. And the only way we can do that if there are standards in place. At least that's my personal opinion. If you feel differently, I'd love to know like how you can rationalize like how this might work otherwise. Beyond that, there's also a public education campaign that's supposed to be set in place with the FDNY in conjunction with the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, previously Department of Consumer Affairs. I believe the Department of Consumer Affairs will also be responsible for enforcing this. I actually got a fine from them. I made a video about it. I got a fine for $25,000, which was a pretty big deal. You could check out the video if you want to learn more about that. Outside of that, FDNY is going to be required to submit 5 reports per year just about like what the different fire risks with power mobility devices. They should include data on fires caused by these devices, actions taken by FDNY. Actually, interestingly enough, this legislation was passed yesterday and we got a visit from FDNY today. 5 firefighters came into our shop in Brooklyn and they're like, hey, what's going on? We need to like check out what you got going on. Is everything safe in here? And I think that they were very surprised, and because we knew exactly what was going on. They're like, well, listen, everything in here is UL. We have safe charging standards. We're good. They're like, oh, cool. Like, and we kind of made some friends there. I think that they're having very different experiences visiting some of the other shops throughout the city. There's been some reports of this going on already, you know, in shops that are getting violations. And beyond that, the Department of Consumer Worker Protection is going to be required to develop and publish educational materials on e-bike safety risks and mitigation measures for delivery workers. It also requires third-party delivery apps such as Seamless, Uber Eats, etc. to distribute these materials to delivery workers. And keep in mind that that's the majority of delivery workers out there are kind of operating under this heading of like, you know, delivery workers like working for apps. I think that they do have some responsibility to help with this. So that's the basics of the legislation that was introduced, but there's a lot of other legislation that's pending on the back of this. What are you going to do about the 60,000 plus e-bikes that are already out on the streets that are likely not in compliance? To my understanding, there's a lot of things going on. They're planning to have some sort of like buyback incentive program to swap batteries or e-bikes. I think it will likely have to be the latter because I don't think that's going to be so easy to make a battery that's so just easy to swap. I think that that's one area that's not really fully solved. Actually, there's a lot of areas that are not fully solved. They're also going to create, you know, some different storage and different things like that. So I guess if nothing else, at least people could be storing these e-bikes in places that are separate from housing. That's really the big concern, right? As I said, beyond that, they're also advocating for the CPSC to introduce these standards on the federal level. They're creating a fire marshal task force focused on identifying violators of the fire code. The task force will use data to identify potential violators in high-risk situations or hotspots, which will be targeted for outreach and inspection and compliance with existing fire codes. So actually, that's something that people may or may not know, but the actual New York City fire code that exists today requires UL. That was introduced last year. So I think the fire department learned pretty quickly that, hey, this is the standard. And I think that they actually helped to educate the city council to say, if you want things to be safe, if it's tested to this standard, it's good. Essentially what these bills do is they give other parties the authority to also enforce the law, that it's not just on the fire department, because it's a big task for them to be responsible for this. And it's kind of a bit unprecedented for them as well. And even though many brands inside the U.S. are not in compliance, the National Bike Dealers Association is also encouraging brands and retailers to get in compliance. Now, I'm not sure if they know something that I don't, but I suspect that they also see the writing on the wall that it's likely going to become a standard and required. So it's better to get ahead of this thing. But I'm sure companies are going to do what they want to do, and maybe they'll just deal with the consequences. Now, I should clarify that this law doesn't change anything around the use. You still can own and use a e-bike that's not certified, but I think that there's going to be more and more legislation to encourage people to make this change. But in the short term, I think they're thinking about it just to kind of stop the bleeding, if you will. Well, that was a bit of a long video. I hope you guys enjoyed. There's a lot to cover here. As you can tell, this is kind of something that I got a lot of thoughts on. I got a lot of experience with, and really it's something that's been impacting me so much personally and our business over the past several years. I'm excited that some positive change is happening here. I feel for and I'm concerned for those that are going to be impacted by this, but I feel like this is a good path forward and this is the direction that we need to go. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope to be making some more soon. I haven't been making as many lately. I got a newborn at home, as you guys might have seen in my last video, but I'll see you soon, and hopefully I'll see you out there on the road. I mean, the weather's getting nice, and let's go for a ride.